Is what it was, what it shall be. Back again. Today's video, Spirit War Boot Camp number 81. And this is entitled Secret Societies and Plasma Beings. So how's everyone doing? So this is a continuation dealing with our previous video. In that one we were talking more about modern applications of science and technology dealing with plasma and energy fields and how this is relevant to the spirit world. And like I said, the plasma domain is somewhat of the interface between the physical world in terms of our bodies and our brains, our thoughts, right, and this energy realm, right, which is kind of like the barrier or the borderline between the material world and the spirit world. And I thought about doing a whole video on history and mythology of plasma beings and the interactions between humans and plasma beings. That's something that's coming up for the future. But today I wanted to focus on very, very specific something which is highly relevant right now given our political climate. And this is dealing with secret societies and all the secret societies connecting to the Masonic orders. And again, this goes back to the Knights Templar, of course. And prior to that, a lot of people talk about different groups like the Thomasine Masons and these different, there's all these different secret societies and orders that are pre-Masonic, but in essential are dealing with the craft of building, right? So let's talk about plasma beings in the context of this Masonic and Templar mythology in specific. Okay, so first of all, everyone knows about the connection between the Masonic order and Baphomet, which was dismissed as a hoax way back, but it's not at all a hoax. So let's look at this. I brought this back to Paphos Metis, right? The city of Paphos being the birthplace of Aphrodite, right? And a cult center in the Mediterranean going way, way back on the island of Cyprus. And so this relates to a story called Pygmalion, right? And how this great sculptor, right? So again, we're dealing with the craft and dealing with stone in particular. So he builds a sculpture of Aphrodite and then invokes this spirit of Aphrodite, enters into it, and he falls in love with the statue. Okay, so now a lot of people don't see the relevance of this right away to Masonry, but basically we'll explain that of what that's about. And so it's dealing with invocation. And again, invocation is a magnetic science, okay, dealing with these plasma entities, right? And so this is why, for instance, some of the really basic things, like anyone who knows anything about Masonry, like if you look into the first degree initiations, well, of course, the candidates have to remove all the metal off their bodies and actually strip down into these like Masonic undergarments, right? They have to tear open their shirt and put a noose around their neck and get down on one knee and so on like that. So it's a submission thing, first of all. But so what's up? Why do they remove all the metal? Well, as most people know, like the majority of amulets in the tradition of magic and stuff like that are made out of metal to protect from what? Plasma entities, right? Because if you're wearing a highly conductive metal, silver, gold, and copper, right, and some plasma entity tries to get into you, it's going to get stuck in this metallic object. Like that object's going to like suck it up and absorb it and prevent it from entering into you. And so that's why people tend to wear these metallic amulets, and especially groups that are dealing directly with these spirit bodies, the Ba and the Ka, like the ancient Egyptians or the wizards and sorcerers. Like they're really fond of these gemstones and precious metals, and that's why the breastplate of the high priest, Kohen Gadol in Hebrew, is wearing a breastplate made out of brass, metal, and all these different things, and he's got all these gemstones, right? And it explicitly talks about how the gemstones are related to capturing different spirits of the 12 astrology signs, right? Or the 12 tribes, or however you want to think it. But again, that was an astrological metaphor. But anyway, so we're seeing some of these connections here, but you could go a lot deeper than that, and that's what I want to do in today's video. So another long video that I want to make was dealing with the craniosacral system. So this is very, very much connected into what we're dealing with, because obviously, you know, the craniosacral pump is pumping this so-called cerebrospinal fluid, which circulates all the way from the base of the spine up into the skull. And basically the brain is like floating in this fluid. And so, of course, a lot of people will know, dealing with the Templars going way back and their initiatory rites, and how you have to kiss the anus of your initiator, right? And the initiated person gets that same kind of kiss. So what they're doing is they're contacting the base of the spine. Okay. Now let's, if people find this far afield and they're like, oh no, that's not what masonry is about. Okay, well, let's just look at Solomon's temple. Let's look at the biblical myth of Solomon's temple and all the most common prosaic lore about that. Well, what is that? What is that story? So Solomon's building what? He's building a big temple out of fancy marble and stuff, all these electrostatic and piezoelectric substances, marble and stone. And of course, there's tons of gold. There's tons of these what's called shittim wood, like the Ark of the Covenant's made out of this wood from the acacia tree, which again is a DMT producing plant, first of all, but it has a lot of interesting electrostatic properties due to the sap and the density of the wood and so on like that. So we're dealing with an electrostatic structure, first of all, which is this double cube, right? The Solomon's temple is a double cube. And so again, that's pertaining to, there's a lot of geometry behind that and what's so-called silver ratio, this mathematical constants and so on like that. But at any rate, so the building trade is highly connected to containing plasma entities, right? And so again, dealing with plasma, again, we're talking about the temple is there to basically replace what's called the tabernacle, which is this big desert tent. And so what do they do in the tabernacle? Well, they fumigate it with incense, right? And they got this whole idea from the Scythians, for instance. And so the Scythians, some people say that that word skutoi, called by the Greeks skutoi, this word, or skutos, means to fumigate and have a big smoky cloud. Because the Scythians were big hemp producers, right? And they were always, they wouldn't physically bathe with water like normal people, or like we think of as bathing now, but they would basically fumigate themselves with cannabis smoke. And there's all these ritual implements that they found, different cups and bowls from that were coated with resins of cannabis that are like thousands of years old. So we know that this is part of their big rite. And of course, in the tabernacle, right, we have the sacred incense with the cannabosem, they call it in Hebrew, which is just cannabis. That's where we got the word cannabis from, right? And so they fumigate everything with this cannabosem. And so what does that do? It creates a cloud. Okay, again, dealing with plasma and clouds. So we're dealing with dust in the air and these little fine particles of dust and carbon molecules, and we're dealing with negative ions, right? So if you want to invoke a plasma being, an electrical type of phenomenon, it's really good to have a cloud of negative ions. And that's why incense is everywhere in every religion in the world, because they're working with plasma entities. Okay, so first they conduct this, they build this double cube tabernacle, or they build this double cube, marble and cedar wood structure to serve as a resonant chamber for these plasma entities. Okay, but now we're going to get into this, so everybody knows that none of that's really disputable, but I'm just pointing out all of this stuff has to do with electrostatics, has to do with clouds of plasma. Okay, and these different entities, right? And that's why they strip you of all the metal, so that these entities can get a more privileged access to your physical domain of your body to influence you and your nervous system. And so a lot of people will be like, oh, you're just speculating or whatever. Okay, well, let's go deeper. So let's talk about this show. There's a show, I forget which network it's on, but it was called High Maintenance. And it's just a show about this weed delivery guy. I think it's in New York City or something like that, some urban area where he's delivering weed. And so for whatever reason, I think I was doing something else with people that I know. And so we were watching the show, because I would have never wanted to watch this kind of disgusting crap that's on TV. And there's something particularly disgusting in this particular episode, which for me, this is the first time I've ever seen sodomy depicted in a TV show. And so there's this scene of sodomy with this guy, and they show it quite graphically. And in the background on the wall, most people would have never noticed this. Immediately during the scene, in the background on the wall, there's a picture of Solomon's temple. So what is that about? Why is that? A lot of people know, if you've any kind of biblical scholar, that there's a lot of stories in the Bible about homosexuality. A lot of people argue that the basis of circumcision is to prevent these different fecal bacteria from inhabiting underneath the foreskin, right? That's why they circumcised the army. So, but anyway, then also there's this story about David. Of course, the name David in Hebrew means beloved, right? But then we have this gay story of David and Jonathan. It's clearly depicted in the Bible about a homo relationship right there, and it's quite obvious once you know what to look for. But anyway, so we'll skip over that. People might not believe that, but let's go and let's talk about these different initiatory rites. So they have this thing dealing with the capstone in Masonry. It's very prominent, the keystone and the capstone. And so I think it's called the Royal Arch degree. It might be the 7th degree. Depends on which, there's different rites and they rank the degrees in different order. But in any way, the Royal Arch degree has to do with this capstone. And the shape of the capstone or the keystone just happens to be a pretty clear match for the sacrum bone at the base of the spine, which is where, you know, that's where our two hips join together in the sacrum. And in the sacrum bone, there's what's called 8 sacral foramen in the sacrum. So how, like, what would be this connection? Why is this considered the keystone? Well, the rites of Masonry and these different initiatory rites all revolve around sodomy. For there's 2 specific purposes. First of all, it's to forcibly press the cerebral spinal fluid up to the skull and the third eye, to forcibly awaken these different psychic faculties through trauma, so that in the mind of the initiate, of these faculties and their exercise is always associated with psychic trauma. First of all, pain, intense pain, submission, first of all, and also sexual gratification, right? So it's a type of mind programming. And that's why so many of these politicians that we're seeing, why are they so easy to ensnare by Epstein, who is also himself a homosexual or bisexual, just like Les Wexner, who gave him his big mansion with the bust of Saturn and the satyr, the bust of these, you know, Saturnine deities and these bacchanalians on the, you know, on the capstone and the keystone right over the entrance and the doorway to Jeffrey Epstein's house, because he's a Saturnist, right? And he's worshiping these Saturnalian gods, and he's got their head displayed prominently over the door to his house. Okay, it's not a coincidence. And so we're looking at the sacral foramen and these eight sort of holes in the sacrum and the spine. And when you go into the Royal Arch degree, there's a motto of 8 letters representing the sacred foramen, and they call this the keystone. And it revolves around this initiatory rite. And I think the 8 letters represent this phrase, something like, you know, the stone that the builder refused. Basically, that's what it's all pertaining to, and how this will be made into the keystone. And of course, the Masons are builders, and on and on. So what is it they're building? Okay, so they say that they're building a temple that's built without hands. And so what does that mean? We also have the phrase in the Bible, the body is the temple. Everyone knows about that. So if the body is a temple and they're building a temple without hands, they're building a temple within the body. But who is dwelling in this temple? Okay, this is the question that you need to ask yourself. And so this gets into spirit possession. And I've made previous videos about the connection between parasites, particularly fecal parasites, with these different initiatory orders, and the effects of fecal parasites on the consciousness of humans, and how it's a type of possession, basically, and it changes the human's behavior, changes their thought patterns, and in essence, it's a vector for these entities to physically enter into the body of a human being and manipulate their behavior. And just like parasites, these different types of parasites and worms that inhabit the body, they have a type of hive consciousness, okay? And so basically what you're doing through this ritual is you're creating a hive consciousness, and you're allowing for possession of an egregore. So an egregore is like a collective mass consciousness that has a mental influence on a large group of people. Whoever participates in the ritual and whoever repeats the ritual over and over, they're basically tapping into this hive consciousness, right? And so they're allowing this entity or this plasma intelligence to enter into their body through the vector of these parasites, okay? And I know this is gross and everything, people hate to think about it, but we need to really start to ponder how this is influencing our world and our politics and so on like that. Now, there's a particular fecal parasite that's called Toxoplasmosis gondii, which is associated with cats, okay? Cats and dogs. It possesses both cats and dogs. It's a fecal parasite. It lives in their intestines. And so everybody knows about the cat lady phenomenon, and how a lot of times females will have a bunch of cats in their house. And once they do that, they have a certain amount of cats. everybody that has cats or dogs, they have some degree of infestation with these parasites, but cat ladies have a bunch of cats in their house, right? So their probability of being highly infected in a very persistent way with these parasites goes up, 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 right? And you'll notice that these cat ladies tend to, number one, become hoarders. And number two, they don't clean up the cat feces, right? So where a natural human being who's healthy would have an aversion to the smell of cat feces and cat urine, cat ladies do not have such a reaction. In fact, quite the contrary. They find this to be desirable and they like it because the parasite has hacked their consciousness and has hacked their behavioral patterns and subverted the normal human aversion to these types of things to where now they find it attractive. And I don't want to be, I'm not trying to be gross for no reason, but I'm telling you, this is part and parcel of the homosexual tendencies, right? They have fecophilia. They associate the smell of feces and rectal blood and stuff like that. That's turns them on, right? They associate that with sexual gratification. So again, it's evidence that a normal human proclivity to have an aversion to feces and urine and these types of human bodily waste products flips over, and now they have an attraction to that. It turns them on because they have an associative connection between sexual gratification and this thing. And so also, if they're subjected, right, to this rite and they're being sodomized forcibly by other people who have a rope and a chain around their neck, just like in the Masonic initiation, and particularly if they're initiated at a very young age, like all these de Molay order people or these Eagle Scouts and stuff like that, they get into this at a very young age, and so it affects their development, right? And so they associate sexuality with this dominance and submission, right? But also, whether knowingly or unknowingly, it's with the transference of this parasite and the transference of this extraneous human consciousness into a host, right? So when you're looking at the other Masonic rites around building the buildings in a certain proportionality, having the fumigation of these different types of smoke, having negative ions in the environment, stripping all the initiates of metal that would normally protect them from this entity possession, right? And like I said, this is in the Bible, okay? It's not disputable that Solomon was known to have built the temple using demons, okay? That's right out there. No one disputes that. That's why he has the Solomon's ring, and that's why he has the sigil of Solomon and these different things that he uses to trap, contain, and manipulate demons, okay? And so what is Masonry? It's all about building Solomon's temple. What is that? It's replacing the normal human consciousness with an extraneous consciousness. So inhabiting the temple with these entities that are overtly referred to. And if you get into stuff like the Golden Dawn or these different things, they'll openly talk about the Goetia, which is 72 demons that were supposedly mastered by King Solomon. And like if you go on the dollar bill and look at the pyramid, why is there 72 bricks that make up the pyramid? Okay, hello, this is the 72 demons of the Goetia. So this is something that's a very profound influence in our society, but it's behind the scenes, and that's why they create a taboo, and that's why they create a sort of social stigma against homosexuality, because that stigma and that embarrassment of people being exposed as homo-pedo, like Jeffrey Epstein and all these different political people playing YMCA at their political, it's like, why is that? So they're blackmailed. They've been put into this situation. They're blackmailed and they're manipulated by these secret societies because of the stigma against the type of, fetishes that they have and the experiences that they've been into and the demonic possession that they've been subjected to. Okay, this runs our world. It runs our government. It runs our banking system. It runs our education, media. Why are there so many prominent Masonic lodges in Hollywood? Why are there most of these people that run the major media companies are these Sabbatean Frankists, and they all belong to these secret societies of various different types? It's not a coincidence. And so the fictional world that surrounds us today is the product of these people. It's the product of their secret orders. All the beliefs and product placement and all the social cues and all our mythology that defines our society is created by these people to produce a particular type of effect within the consciousness of people without them even knowing it, right? Like they think these are their own ideas. Just like a person that's possessed and has all these parasites inside their body thinks that those are the parasite's commands are its own personal thoughts, right? This is the kind of situation that we're living in. And this is why I'm teaching the science of plasma intelligence in the spirit war, because this is essential to people. And this is why we have the technology that we have being rolled out is what they call the revelation of the method and the externalization of the hierarchy. They're creating an external structure to implement their goals through. And this is why we have the internet. Okay, what the internet and all these devices that we're carrying around, it's a technological method of inducing the same type of possession by these plasma intelligences on a mass scale of millions of people, because the methods that they were using previously weren't effective enough. There's too many layers of secrecy and all these different control structures and all this infrastructure that they would have to have. But now that we have all these Wi-Fi towers everywhere emitting radio frequencies and microwaves, like all that stuff is no longer necessary. And you can basically, it's inescapable. Like where normally you would have had to gone into the lodge to be subjected to all this kind of stuff. Now the lodge is everywhere. The lodge is in every single town in every city where there's, and now we got Starlink up in the sky, right? So time to learn and understand how to defend yourself against this. And we're going to have a lot of future videos that explain the technology of this in detail. The next video maybe on just the science of plasma itself, and so we understand this phenomenon, how to defend ourselves, how to recognize this influence, and how to protect against it. And so I'm going to leave it at that for now, and hopefully more to come.